Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. As you can see, today is this month's patron pick, and the topic is what is hidden card error? And this is a really big topic, so I've got a lot of material to go through, so I'm just going to jump right into it. First of all, a little bit of history. Some people really are interested in stuff like this. For everybody else, I'm sure Editing Dave is going to have your back. Okay, so a while ago, several years ago, there was this infraction that was called drawing extra cards. And the name pretty much says it all. You got this infraction if you drew additional cards. And there are like legitimate ways that you could draw extra cards accidentally. I'm sure that the first thought on a lot of people's minds is that, drawing extra cards means that they were cheating. And certainly that is a possibility, but it's also a possibility that maybe when you're drawing for turn, two of your sleeves stick together, or maybe you draw for your turn on the first turn of the game when you're playing first, which maybe you got distracted or something, or maybe you pick up some cards and you count wrong, and so as a result you end up with an extra card in your hand when you're playing a big draw spell. Stuff like that does happen, and it can happen legitimately too. And so this infraction, drawing extra cards, was meant to cover cases like what I was just talking about. Now it turns out that with drawing extra cards, you've got a little bit of an extra problem as opposed to a normal game rule violation that you might encounter, which is that maybe like if I attack with a creature and it has lifelink and I don't gain life. Well, both players can see that I didn't gain life with my attacking creature that had lifelink, right? If I try to play a spell that costs 2 and a blue and I tap 3 lands, but none of the lands can produce blue mana, like that's a mistake that both people can see. With drawing extra cards, it's actually a lot harder to see someone commit that mistake because people are drawing cards all the time. But even more seriously, there's an additional problem with drawing extra cards, which is that once someone does commit the error, it's not possible to back up to the point immediately before the error unless you're willing to take that player's word for it, what the extra card that they drew is, which obviously is not something that's really on the table. If you're a judge, you can't just say like, oh, okay, buddy, like, after you drew an extra card, which of those cards is the extra card? And, maybe I should clarify a little bit. At regular rel, it might be okay to do something like that, but certainly at like a competitive rules enforcement environment where people are playing for significant prizes, you can see how that's not really an ideal solution to trust somebody that this one card is the specific card that I drew extra for the turn. The level of trust that would need to happen for that to work is not really there. So, okay, that is the reason why drawing extra cards had something that was a little bit unusual. It had a harsher penalty than just a normal game rule violation. And in fact, the penalty for drawing extra cards was that you would lose the game. And, that seems kind of harsh by today's standards, but at the time, it made perfect sense. And you have to remember that I made a video about this. Magic's policy has gone through a lot of revisions, and we've gone through a lot of different different philosophies for as far as what the penalties for different infractions should be. But that's where we were at a few years ago. And the idea behind that was, it's not possible to restore the game state that should have existed in that game. So it's not really possible for anybody to, bring the game state back to what happened if there were no error. So we're just going to penalize the person who committed that error and brought about that game state as appropriate. And the thought was that it was appropriate to issue a game loss for that sort of situation. Then we kind of went through a little bit of a philosophical shift, and Magic had a lot of different types of things that you could do that would lead to a game loss. And we started thinking to ourselves, we meaning the people who actually wrote these policy documents that govern these situations. And the thinking was like this: well, it really is kind of bad to have all these game losses. Isn't there something we could do where maybe we could fix the error as best we can, and we could continue on? And so that was like the philosophical shift. And the hidden card error infraction is kind of like the first step along that journey. And there are actually several steps, and now several things that used to be game losses in a game of Magic are not game losses anymore. And there still are a few. There still are a few that both are an infraction that's very difficult to notice and very easy to gain an advantage on, and very compromising to the game state. There still are some infractions like that, but certainly it's a lot less, and so therefore the number of game losses that judges have had to give out is much less than it was certainly a few years ago. And so the main idea then was that drawing extra cards was one of those infractions. And also another kind of interesting thing that you'll see maybe towards the end of the presentation, if you've ever played with the morph mechanic, having unrevealed morph cards used to be something that gave you a game loss. If you, at the end of the game, did not reveal all of the cards that you had played using the morph mechanic that were still face down to make sure that they still had morph, that used to be a game loss, but they actually converted that to just not being a game loss anymore. However, you still can get a game loss if you get caught somehow playing a card that does not have morph face down. So we'll talk a little bit about that like towards the end of this presentation. But for now, let's talk about this new infraction, the hidden card error, which is kind of big. But before we talk too much about hidden card error, we want to talk a little bit about sets and some infractions in the IPG. That's where the text for this presentation was copied from, the Magic Infraction Procedure Guidelines. Some infractions refer to sets of cards, and spoiler alert, hidden card error is going to be one of those infractions. A set is a physically distinct group of cards defined by a game rule or effect. So a set might be a zone, like for example your hand would be a common example of a set, or your library or your graveyard. Those would be sets. But like also like for example, if you were to play a card that says something like look at the top 4 cards of your library, right? Like when you play that card, you're going to physically pick up the top 4 cards of your library. And even though, as far as the game rules are concerned, those 4 cards are still in your library, as far as the Magic policy is concerned, they actually constitute an independent set. So that's what it says here. A set may correspond to only part of a zone. So that would be an example of how that could work. And yes, a set can consist of a single card. Sometimes you have 1 card in your hand, sometimes you have 1 card in your library, sometimes you're scrying 1 and you're deciding whether you want to put that card on top or the bottom. Those would all be examples of a situation where a set consists of just 1 card. Okay, so another important thing about sets and like the kind of philosophy for how we use sets is cards are considered to be part of a set until they join another set. Right, so that's the philosophy. There isn't a time when the card that you're looking at, like for example in that example I say where a card tells you to look at the top 4 cards of your library. There's no time in between when the card is in your library and when it's in the set of 4 cards that you're looking at. There isn't like a in between set that it goes to in between those 2 spots. It's either in one of them or the other, and so we also consider that a card that has not yet been seen should be considered to be part of the previous set, unless the new set is hidden. So, like for example, if I like pick up, like if I physically touch the 5th card of my library after I've already got 4, but like everybody can agree that I have only like picked it up and like started to lift it, but I couldn't have seen it yet. That means that it's not yet part of the 4 cards. So I haven't yet committed a hidden card error infraction. So that would be basically like all we need to know about sets, and we'll talk a little bit more about like how these specific clauses apply to sets when we get into talking a little bit more about how the specific examples of infractions are. So let's talk a little bit about some specific examples. So this is the definition given by the Infraction Procedure Guide for hidden card error. A player commits an error in the game and it cannot be corrected by only publicly available information. All right. So because this is the IPG and it's enforced at competitive rules enforcement tournaments, I'm going to be assuming for the rest of this presentation that this is a 2-player game of Magic. And as far as I'm aware, there aren't any situations, certainly not commonly, where the IPG would be consulted in not a 2-player game of Magic. So I think that's kind of a fair assumption to make. So one of the examples that they gave for this would be a player drawing 4 cards after they play Ancestral Recall. Ancestral Recall, of course, says to draw 3 cards. So if you were to draw 4 cards, accidentally, of course, after drawing or after playing the Ancestral Recall, then that would be a case of a hidden card error, because there's an extra card in your hand And I would know, like whichever player played the Ancestral Recall, that player would know for sure what the fourth card would be, and what the specific card in their hand that is supposed to actually be in the library still. The player who can see their hand, that player knows which card that is, but the other player has no way of knowing that information. And so as a result, it's not possible to correct that error with publicly available information. Same sort of thing, a player scries two cards when they were instructed to scry one. And again, that happens all the time if players like two sleeves on the top of their deck stick together, or if the player is playing like a new set and they confuse X draw spell with Y draw spell when one of them says scry two and the other one says scry one. Stuff like that can happen. This one is kind of interesting. A player resolves a Dark Confidant trigger but forgets to reveal the card before putting it in their hand. So Dark Confidant, of course, says at the beginning of your upkeep, you reveal the top card of your library, and then you put it in your hand, and then you lose life equal to its mana value. Well, if you forget to reveal it, then there's no way to say how much life you're supposed to be losing for sure. And only the person who committed that infraction would be able to know for sure which card it was, and therefore how much life is the appropriate amount that they should be losing. A player has more cards in their hand than can be accounted for. So this one doesn't come up as much, but if it happens during a game that a player has the judge determines that a player has more cards in their hand than they should based on what turn it is and what cards that they've played so far, then that would be an example of when they could issue this infraction. Player casts Anticipate and picks up the top 4 cards of their library. Anticipate says look at the top 3 cards of your library, so that would be a case where that would happen. And a player who plays first draws for their turn. So those are all examples that the IPG gives for this infraction. So all right, now let's take a little bit of thought about what the philosophy is for how we should be fixing these. So this is the underlying this is what the people who wrote the policy were thinking about when they were deciding what fixes and penalties should be assigned to this stuff, right? So though the game state cannot be reversed to the correct game state, i.e. the state that would exist if no error had been committed, the infraction exists, the error that can be mitigated by giving the opponent sufficient knowledge and ability to offset the error so that it's less likely to generate advantage. So basically the idea is, even though we cannot get back to the state that the game should be in if there was no error committed, we can at least give the opponent the opportunity to offset that error. And if the opponent is given that information, then it should be possible to make it so that nobody would intentionally commit this error, knowing that they're not going to be able to get the game state back right anyway, because the chances for them getting caught would lead to severe enough consequences that they might want to think twice. That's maybe a cynic's way to put it. But for example, there were certainly situations back before when the penalty for drawing extra cards was a game loss, where it was kind of a meme in the Magic community that you should never scoop because your opponent might always draw an extra card, and then you could get bailed out that way. And if you really think about it, if you're in a winning position and you're gonna win the game next turn, and it doesn't even matter what card you are gonna draw this turn because you've got everything basically locked up, you're not gonna actually cheat in that situation, right? There's no reason a rational person would do that. So the only real thing that could happen that would cause you to would be if you drew an extra card accidentally. And even if you drew a card accidentally, there are situations where people were told that the penalty for what they just did, where they accidentally had 2 cards stick together when they were drawing for turn. There are situations where people would be like, well, what if I just shuffle my whole hand into my library, right? Wouldn't that be okay? And the penalty was a game loss. But the judge community started thinking, and wouldn't it make sense if it literally does, a player would literally rather have the game be able to continue where they still have a chance to win than just ending the game right there. And if we did actually shuffle their whole hand into their library, wouldn't that be a situation that's objectively worse than the situation that the game state should be in from that player's perspective? And so thoughts like that are the reason that we started thinking about this. So thoughts like that are the reason that we as a judge community started thinking about this and trying to find ways that we could make it not be a game loss. And this is the sort of stuff that we came up with. So okay, first we'll talk a little bit about identifying when a hidden card error has occurred. So obviously this is the first one I want to talk about. If the judge believes that a player intentionally did something they knew was against the rules to try to benefit from it, that's not a hidden card error. That's cheating, right? Like so. I shouldn't really have to say this, but I feel like especially it's important to mention it here because again, when people see these kinds of infractions of like having extra cards in your hand, that's the first thing a lot of people jump to is well, they're cheating. So why would this just be a warning? Which that is the official penalty for most hidden card errors would just be a warning and not a game loss. So okay, yeah, it's cheating. You get DQ'd if you intentionally do it. Don't intentionally do it. All right. Next, we're gonna go through some stuff that's maybe not maybe not as heavy handed here. So it is not a hidden card error if the opponent acknowledges the action that led to the error, or if they control a continuous effect modifying the game rule that made the action illegal. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's say that I control a Spirit of the Labyrinth. Okay, and I already drew for my turn, and I play like a preordain or a ponder, some like spell that lets me draw. Okay, so then I'll say like draw for preordain, and if my opponent says yeah draw for preordain, then my opponent like is not in the situation that we were talking about before, where they didn't really have any way to fix the error, like to keep the error from happening, right? If my opponent specifically says that yeah it's okay for you to draw for preordain, like they had an opportunity to see this error and prevent it, and then they just didn't. And one of the things that the judge program had to like bear in mind when we were creating this philosophy and the policies surrounding hidden card error is, well, we know that the penalty or the fix for hidden card error is going to be a little bit more heavy-handed or a little bit harsher than the fix for a normal infraction because it does have this hidden element to it. And so we thought to ourselves, the original idea was, well, we'll just make the penalty pretty severe because it has to fit this extra potential for abuse. And it turned out that one of the things that happened was we got into a situation where sometimes players were incentivized to allow their opponents to make mistakes because they knew that if I like see this mistake happening and then I point it out to a judge after they did it, then technically that means it's a hidden card error. So I can get like even, I can get a better game state for myself if I let this mistake happen and just go for it afterwards. So a lot of the time we'll see this kind of philosophy where if the opponent had a role in the mistake, then it's not appropriate to handle it with the harsher, more severe fix. You would go to a game rule violation in cases like that. And that's what would happen in the Spirit of the Labyrinth case. Like, if I have a Spirit of the Labyrinth out, yes, it's my Spirit of the Labyrinth, and yes, I should know what it does, but I'm going to forget some percentage of the time, right? Like, that's because I'm a human. Like, if my opponent also forgets about it in a spot, where they could have prevented me from making an error, then it's not right to penalize me extra harshly for something just because my opponent didn't feel like helping me when they easily could have. And also, by the same token, if my opponent controls a Spirit of the Labyrinth and I draw an extra card off of it, I draw an extra card during my turn after the first one, then it's like also not as good of an idea to give the harsher penalty to me, even though I drew the extra card, because it's my opponent's card that like made it so that I didn't get to draw an extra card. So my opponent, because it's their Spirit of the Labyrinth, has an extra duty to make sure that I'm playing correctly based on the cards that they control. And that's another thing that kind of evolved over the years, is we found a need to make a little bit more leniency for when players are making mistakes as a result of effects that their opponents control. And so in either of those cases, you would not be dealing with a hidden card error. You would handle that as a game rule violation instead. Okay, the infraction only applies when a card whose identity is known to only one player is in a hidden set of cards both before and after the error. So what does that mean? Well, like for example, let's say we played this Boggart Birthright, and we brought a Grizzly Bears from our graveyard to our hand. Okay, and so after I physically did that, I think to myself, oh wait, because Grizzly Bears is not a goblin card in my graveyard, and maybe I had like some kind of an enchantment on the Grizzly Bears while it was on the battlefield that made it into a goblin. So maybe that's why I was forgetting about that, or maybe like there was a conspiracy in play. That was making it a goblin, but after that, sometime later, the conspiracy got destroyed, so it's not making everything a goblin anymore. So in a situation like that, we would not be dealing with a hidden card error because the infraction only applies to a card whose identity is known to only one player, is in a hidden set of cards both before and after the error. So with that being the case, the goblin, the Boggart Birthright returned it from my graveyard to my hand. So when it was in my graveyard, that was before the error, right? And when it was in the graveyard, it's not hidden. My opponent knows it was a Grizzly Bears that I picked up. Or, they could have been paying attention and known that it was a Grizzly Bears that I picked up. And so with that being the case, the harsher penalty isn't warranted because my opponent had the opportunity to, the extra information, we are able to correct it with publicly available information. So that would not fit under the definition that we talked about earlier. If an additional card is seen but not added to the set, the infraction is looking at extra cards. So this is something that you see players do a lot of the times. They'll put the top 3 cards of their library, like they'll count them out, or they'll like draw them one at a time. So they'll like draw 1, 2, 3, and then like when they pick up their 4th one, maybe they see it, but they didn't put it in with the other like rest of their cards in their hand, right? So in a situation like that, we would not be dealing with hidden card error because we still know which card is the one that should be getting put back, right? We are not in a situation where it's been added to the hidden set yet, so it hasn't transitioned into being a hidden card error yet. And so this is where we get like kind of the conventional wisdom that it has to like physically touch with the rest of the cards in your hand in order for you to count as having drawn that card. This is the like policy background for that. Like it's not really a rule or a ruling. It's just like kind of a conventional wisdom. But this is the like official version of that, I suppose. Okay, so if cards are placed into a public zone, then their order is known, and then fraction can be handled as a game rule violation. I think this clause probably of the document is like among the most confusing and like the most difficult to approach if you don't have like a background in it. So I'm going to kind of go through sentence by sentence here. So if the cards are placed into a public zone, so public zones would be like exile, battlefield, graveyard, then their order is known. And like the word order here doesn't really do a great job, I think, of describing what we're trying to get across. It's basically the idea is that if we know what card it is, then we don't need to have hidden card error be the infraction. That's basically the idea that we're trying to get across with like this clause here. So sometimes there's a situation that'll happen when even though it's in the graveyard or the exile zone or the battlefield. I don't know about the graveyard, but like certainly with the exile zone and the battlefield, you can have cards enter the battlefield face down or the exile zone face down. And so if we're doing something like that, then hypothetically, at least, as far as the rules are concerned, the game keeps track of the order at which the cards entered those zones. And so it is possible, therefore, at least in principle, to know which specific card is the last card that entered the battlefield or the last card that entered the exile zone. And so that's the meaning behind this sentence here. So if the cards are going to a public zone, then the infraction can be handled as a game rule violation because at least in principle, the identity of the card that was improperly put into that zone should be known to both players as the last card that was put into that zone. Order cannot be determined from card faces visible to only one player unless it's in a uniquely identifiable position, such as the top of the library, the only card in hand. So that's why I have the Enlightened Tutor here. So an example of this would be, let's say I play an Enlightened Tutor, right? And I get a card and I don't reveal that card and I put it on top of my library. And then I say go. And then my opponent's like, okay, wait a sec, you didn't show what cards you got with the enlightened tutor. That is not a case of a hidden card error because the card that we got is still on top of the library. And so that means that we don't need to treat it as a hidden card error because there isn't any extra advantage, because even though it still is in a hidden zone and my opponent didn't get a chance to look at it, we still know which physical card it is that I got with the enlightened tutor. So that means that we don't need to handle this any different from a normal, where we would just reveal the top card of my library. So that's the kind of the meaning behind this other sentence here. And like we would have like the same sort of situation if like I tutored for something and I didn't reveal it and I put it in my hand. If it's the only card in my hand, then it doesn't matter that I didn't reveal it, at least as much, because we can still reveal the card that I have in my hand now, and that'll still that would take care of the fact that I haven't revealed it, so to speak. Be careful not to apply this situation, not to apply this infraction in situations where a publicly correctable error subsequently leads to an uncorrectable situation, such as a brainstorm cast using green mana. In those situations, the infraction is based on the root cause. So, like, let's say we had a situation where Amy plays a brainstorm by tapping a forest, and Nick says, okay, no problem, and then Amy resolves the brainstorm, and then afterwards, Nick is like, hey, wait a sec, you tapped a forest, not an island. So, in that case, we do have a game state that we cannot bring, we can't rewind through the casting of the brainstorm using only publicly available information. That's true. However, the infraction that was committed was not a hidden card error. And the reason for that is because the first time someone did something that was against the rules was when Amy attempted to cast a brainstorm using mana that was not blue. And that is a mistake that we can correct using publicly available information. Right? Like, Nick could have seen that Amy tapped the forest to play the brainstorm, and with that being the case, he could have pointed out that the brainstorm cast was illegal. However, afterwards, because Amy played the brainstorm illegally, she resolved it correctly. There wasn't anything wrong or illegal about what physical action she took when she did resolve the brainstorm. And so, with that being the case, this is not a example of a hidden card error. Another example of not a hidden card error would be, like, let's say we played the Enlightened Tutor and we didn't reveal the top card, we didn't reveal the artifact or enchantment card that we found. We just put it on top of our library. Then we went to our draw step and drew that card. Okay? Now, we do not have the card, we do not have the information available to reconstruct the game state to be able to specifically reveal the card that we searched for. However, we still have this same situation that's covered by this clause, because it was a publicly correctable error up until the point where we physically drew the card from the Enlightened Tutor. However, it's has later led to an uncorrectable situation. Because now the card that we did get that we didn't reveal is in our hand, so we don't have the ability to reveal the specific card that we got with the Enlightened Tutor anymore. Now, if we had a situation come up where, like, for example, it was the only card in our hand, we still could correct it, so that'd be great. But a lot of the time, that's not going to be the case. Another thing that can happen is, a lot of the time when people play Enlightened Tutor, they play at end step, right? So sometimes they'll just play end step, put the card in their hand, and then shuffle, and then they'll like untap, and then they won't take their draw for that turn. So obviously, in that case, we did not have a publicly correctable error that led to an uncorrectable situation, because the card that we physically got, even though it was officially on top of our library and then we drew it for the draw step, like, that's not what actually physically happened in the game. So when we're talking about policy, it's important to remember that we need to apply what the policy documents say to the physical actions that specifically took place in the game. So in that case, you would have to like actually do some investigating to see exactly whether or not you have to, as a judge, you have to investigate to see whether or not we did have a situation where a publicly correctable error turned into an uncorrectable situation, or whether it was just an uncorrectable situation from the start. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about the fixes for hidden card error, and so this is all like philosophy and information about like what you would do after you have determined that there was a hidden card error that happened. So first of all, we've got like some like tips before we talk about any individual fixes. So information about cards previously known by the opponent, such as cards previously revealed while on top of the library or by a previous look at hand, can be taken into account when determining the set of cards to which the remedy applies. Okay, so let's say we've got an extra card in our hand, right? So maybe we drew two cards for the turn, but our opponent played a Thoughtseize against us last turn. So hypothetically, then our opponent should be able to know what all of the cards, except for the two extras that we just drew, should be able to know at least what those cards were in our hand. And so that information, if the opponent does have access to information like that, then that can be taken into account when determining what set of cards the remedy applies to. So, for example, in that situation, we might be able to look at the opponent's notes and determine which two cards are the new ones, and the opponent would only be able to choose one of those two cards to go back to the library. Which, spoiler alert, that's what would be happening in that sort of situation. Always operate on the smallest possible set in order to remedy the error. That might mean applying the remedy to only a part of a set as defined by an instruction. So this IPG actually gives us an example here. So if we're playing a collected company, and then sometimes when people play collected company, they'll do this. They'll like, they'll pick up the top few cards, and then their other hand, they'll pick up the next top few cards. If you see something like that happen, and you end up with like more than 6 cards total between both hands, then you would operate on the last set of cards that was drawn. You wouldn't, if you ended up with 7 cards, you wouldn't operate on all 7. You wouldn't take one of the 3 cards that we know for sure should be part of the collected company set because they were the first 3 drawn. You would take from the last 4 that was drawn because that is the part that contains the 1 extra card that we know shouldn't be there. Okay. And then if the set of cards that contained the problem no longer exists, then there's no remedy to be applied. So for example, if we like played a collected company and we did like that 7, we looked at the top 7, but for some reason it wasn't caught until after maybe the player put all the cards on the battlefield, and then they put the rest on the bottom of their library, and then they cracked a fetch land also at end of turn, so now they're shuffling their library. So now it's not possible to really correct that error. So there isn't any way we can really apply a remedy. Same sort of idea if we had like some similar situation where a card said like, look at the top 5 cards of your library, put one of them in your hand, and then shuffle the rest into your library. I'm not sure if there is a card that says something like that, but if there were, then that would be a great example of where we could apply the logic of this clause. Okay. In cases where the infraction was immediately followed by moving a card from the affected set to a known location, such as discarding, putting on top of the library, or playing a land, a simple backup to the point just after the error may be performed. Okay, so here's a situation. Amy plays a brainstorm, and then she draws 4 cards, and then she puts 2 back, and then she starts counting the cards in her hand. Hey, wait a sec. I think I had an extra one in that brainstorm pile. So in a situation like that, it would be possible for you to take the 2 cards, and that's what you would do as a judge. You would take the 2 cards that Amy just put back on top of her library and put them back into her hand. So that way, when we're like correcting the fact that Amy's hand has too many cards in it after she drew with brainstorm, we're operating on the actual set of cards that contains all of the ones that might be the extra card she drew. Similarly, if you just played a spell that, it's not a brainstorm, it's just like, it just says draw 3 cards. If you like draw 3 cards and then play a land, then what you could do is you could return that land to their hand, and then you would be sure that you were operating on the correct set of cards that includes all of the candidates that might be the extra card that got drawn. And that's the reason why this happened, or why we have this line here, is we want to make sure that when we are applying the fix, we're applying a fix that in as many situations as possible can include the card that is the extra problematic card. Okay, so now let's actually get to some physical, things that we can do to fix hidden card error. And there's, I'll say, a couple of different classes of different types of hidden card errors. This is the most common, and we'll kind of see that here. So one of those classes would be this kind of idea where an error put cards into a set prematurely, and other operations involving cards in the set should have been performed first. So here's an example of when that might happen. Maybe the player plays a Faithless Salvaging and then draws and then goes to discard, but their opponent's like, hey, wait a sec, that's not Faithless Looting, it's Faithless Salvaging. So actually you're supposed to discard first and then draw. So that means that the discard operation should have been performed first, and the player prematurely put cards into their hand with that other operation. So in such a case, then, the Faithless Salvaging player would reveal the set of cards that contains the excess. In other words, they reveal their hand after having drawn but before they discard. And remembering the rule that we talked about on a couple slides ago, if they did discard, we can return that card to their hand, so we'll make sure that we're operating on the set that includes all of the cards that might be the problematic one. Then their opponent chooses a number of previously unknown cards. In other words, if the opponent had Thoughtseize them before, they would know cards that are supposed to be in their hand because they have notes from that Thoughtseize. So the opponent has to choose a card that they didn't know about, that they don't know is supposed to be in their hand. It has to be an unknown card. And so we're going to put those cards aside until the point at which they should have been legally added, and then return them to the set. Okay, so a concrete example is, let's say that Amy plays a Faithless Salvaging, and her hand is a Plains and an Island. Okay, so we know, because we're watching over Amy's shoulder as her friend or something, that's what her hand was. It was Plains Island. All right, and then she plays the Faithless Salvaging, and then she draws a swamp. Right, so then we call for a judge because the player committed an infraction. They're supposed to discard first. And so what we're going to do is Amy's going to reveal the set of cards that contains the excess. So in other words, she's going to reveal her hand, which at this time contains a Plains, an Island, and a Swamp. Okay? Then the opponent is going to choose a number of cards that is, too many, right? So in this case, there's one too many, so they would choose one card. If Amy drew two cards, or she had 3 or 4 extra cards, then the opponent would be choosing 3 or 4, or whatever the correct number, in order to bring her hand down to the size that it would have been at the time when she was supposed to be discarding. Okay, so the opponent is going to choose one of those 3 cards that's in Amy's hand at the current time. So maybe he'll say the Plains. And that card's going to get set aside. And we're going to say the Plains is the card that you're drawing off of Faithless Salvaging, but first you have to discard. So Amy could discard the Island or the Swamp, even though the Swamp wasn't actually physically in her hand at the time when she was supposed to be discarding. That's the way that the fix would work. And if you think about it, this actually does mitigate it serves our goal of mitigating the advantage that Amy could get from doing this type of a cheat. If she was, I hate to use the word cheat because we're assuming a priori that it was an accident, but the advantage that Amy gets from drawing before she discards is completely wiped out by the fact that this is the fix, right? Because if Amy draws the Swamp and she really wants the Swamp in her hand, then the opponent is the one who gets to seed Amy's hand and gets to know which 3 cards it is. And the opponent gets to choose which one is the most beneficial for them, personally, the opponent, that is going to be excluded from the set where she gets to discard. So maybe the Swamp is really not what Amy wants to have. So that's good because Amy's not going to be able to discard the Swamp. Because the opponent is going to make it so that the Swamp is one of the 2 cards that is in Amy's actual hand at the time when she gets to do the discard. At the same time, if Amy really wanted to pitch that Plains, then if she draws first, then her opponent is probably going to be able to make her not be able to pitch that Plains due to the fact that they're the one who gets to say which card they think the extra one in the set would be. So that's kind of the logic of how the hidden card error infraction works, and that's how the fix for that situation would go. Okay, if the error involves one or more cards that were supposed to be revealed, then the player reveals the set of cards that contains the unrevealed cards, and their opponent chooses that many previously unknown cards. Man, I gotta say, I don't know how anybody reads this stuff. I really don't. Well, I mean, I read it myself, so I guess so. You don't have to. But yeah, this is pretty dense, and like when we're gonna go through the situation and make things a little bit more straightforward. So like Amy plays a Fabricate. Fabricate says you tutor for an artifact and you're supposed to reveal it and then put it in your hand. But like Amy plays the Fabricate, she didn't reveal it, and she puts it in her hand. Okay, so that player reveals the set of cards that contains the unrevealed. In other words, she reveals her hand, and the opponent chooses that many previously unknown cards. So we've got like that same kind of idea about what we had before, where if the opponent seized you before, then we can take into account the fact that they know for sure some of the cards in your hand are supposed to be in your hand. So those ones would not be eligible for your opponent to say, "Oh yeah, I think Amy like got that card out of her library," because the opponent knows for sure Amy didn't get that card out of her library because it was in her hand when she got Thoughtseize last turn. And again, we remember the like ideas that we talked about with the enlightened tutor example, where if Amy only has one card in her hand, then we know which card it is that got searched for, so we don't need hidden card error to like go back to the point immediately before the error. We can use publicly available information to correct that mistake. And similarly, if we were dealing with like a tutor that put it on top of her library, that wouldn't be an example because of what we were talking about there too. But if we had like the Fabricate situation that I just introduced, then this is what we would do. The opponent looks at Amy's hand, and they choose that many previously unknown cards. So in other words, there's one extra card, so we would be choosing one card out of Amy's hand. And we're going to treat those as the card that wasn't revealed and return them to the set that was being selected from. So the whatever card out of Amy's hand that the opponent picks, we're going to say that's the card that Amy tutored for with the Fabricate, and we're going to put it back into her library. Then Amy gets to reperform the action. So then Amy gets to play the Fabricate normally and tutor for an artifact. Okay, so again, we'll notice that this is there's no way that Amy can end up in a better spot if this error gets caught. So if the opponent notices that Amy didn't reveal with this Fabricate, then the penalty is that Amy has to reveal her entire hand. Then her opponent gets to choose whatever card they want out of Amy's hand, and that card goes back into her library and gets replaced by her tutoring for an artifact. So let's say that Amy actually got a artifact with the Fabricate and put it in her hand. If the opponent, if the opponent picks that artifact and puts it back into her library, then Amy can just get it back again with, when she reperforms the action. Okay? Fair enough. If Amy didn't get an artifact, then Nick gets to pick whichever card in Amy's hand is, from his point of view, the best card to put back, and have her put that card back and get an artifact. And so either way, Amy is not going to be able to get herself into a game theoretically better situation if this error does get caught. And then if recreating the original selection set and reperforming the action would be too disruptive, then we leave the selected cards in hand. So, maybe this doesn't get caught right away. Maybe it gets caught like 2 or 3 turns down the road. And, after that, both players have probably like drawn some cards and played some cards. So trying to like do this procedure at that point would probably be really disruptive to the gameplay. So in a situation like that, we would, basically just say there's no real way to fix this mistake, so we're just going to have everybody keep playing. And, it's not great, it's not ideal, but at the same time, if somebody doesn't reveal with a Fabricate, it's not going to get noticed like 3 turns down the road. It's going to get noticed immediately. And if it doesn't get noticed until 3 turns down the road, then you have to kind of like, be thinking, maybe the opponent deserves some of the negative consequences from this infraction too, since they didn't figure that out until just now. And it's not really practical to make, to get back to the situation where we could correct it easily. So that's the way that class of HCE would happen. And this is another really big one. Oh my gosh, that's a lot of text. So if a set affected by the error contains more cards than it's supposed to contain. So the example here is we're going to play this Council of the Sword Tomy, and it says draw 2 cards. But when Amy like actually draws the cards for Council of the Sword Tomy, she draws 3. Like maybe the sleeves stick together or whatever. But that's the mistake that's happening, right? So if a set affected by the error, in other words, Amy's hand, contains more cards than it's supposed to contain, then that player reveals the set of cards that contains the X. So she reveals her hand, and then the opponent chooses a number of previously unknown cards to reduce it to their correct size. Okay, so Amy reveals her hand, and Nick chooses 1 card out of her hand because he drew 1 extra. And those excess cards are returned to the correct location. So in this case, that would be the library. But you could see that, if maybe we were talking about like, something that like, it's kind of hard to do for hidden card error, but like, maybe if we had a situation where you like put face down exiled cards into the hand, then same sort of situation would happen. They wouldn't get put back in the library, then they'd be returned face down to exile. Okay, so if that location is the library, they shuffle into the random portion. So like, for example, like the random portion of the library would mean the portion of the library where all the cards are random. So if Amy like scried some stuff to the bottom and then played this Council of the Sword Tomy and like drew an extra, then we wouldn't shuffle them. We wouldn't shuffle those 2 cards Amy scried to the bottom back in because we know those 2 cards are supposed to be on the bottom. Similarly, let's see. If the location is the library, they should be shuffled into the random portion unless the owner previously knew the identity of the cards that were illegally moved. So in that case, let's say maybe Amy scried some cards to the top of her library. So if Amy scried 3 cards to the top of her library and then like she drew 3, then Amy's supposed to know what the top card of her library is. So, here's this example with playing with a Sphinx of Jawar Isle, which says you can look at the top card of your library. If you illegally draw a card, in that case, the card gets returned to the top of your library. So we wouldn't shuffle it in if it's supposed to be on the top of your library, and Amy is supposed to know what the top card of her library is. So that's basically what that line is saying there. Okay, and there is one more fix, and I kind of foreshadowed this a little bit at the beginning of the episode, but if we have a situation where a face-down card is cast using Morph, and it's discovered during the course of the game to not have a Morph ability, then the penalty is a game loss. All right, so it used to just be, that was the end of it. It used to be that this was the end of the story, this sentence here. But again, like I said, we kind of like got a little bit softer on stuff that could be a game loss. So we also have this extra clause here, which basically says, okay, what if there's a player who like, plays the Putrid Raptor and passes turn, and then while our opponent's drawing for a turn, maybe notices, oh wait, I grabbed the wrong card when I put it face down. I grabbed like an island or something instead of the Putrid Raptor. So if we have a situation like that where a player has 1 or more cards with a Morph ability in hand and has not added any cards to their hand that could have been a Morph card since the violation happened, and discovered this error themselves, then the upgrade doesn't apply. So if you got a situation like what I described there, where Amy like plays the Putrid Raptor face down and then passes turn, and then, oh wait, I just realized the Putrid Raptor that I thought I played was still in my hand, and I like accidentally played some different card out of my hand face down instead. If you have a situation like that, then Amy can switch the card in her hand that has Morph for the card that she like accidentally played face down. And that is it. So it's kind of interesting because it used to be like a game rule violation that had an upgrade to game loss if you played a Morph that didn't, played something that wasn't a Morph as a Morph face down. But we actually noticed that had some similarities with this like drawing extra cards. And so when we rewrote this infraction for to be hidden card error, that's the reason why it's called hidden card error, not like hand card error or something like that, because it applies to anything that's in a hidden zone and anything that doesn't have publicly available information that can correct. Another interesting another interesting thing that you might be interested in. There is no currently corresponding paragraph that says for foretell. Foretell mechanic works very similar to morph in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of speculation among the judge community that this sort of upgrade should be also available for cases where a player like cast foretold a card that didn't actually have the foretell ability. However, there is no such paragraph in the IPG. If you're the head judge of an event, you might you might put something like that in there yourself, but it would in fact be a deviation from the actual policy that we have written at the time when this video was recorded. And so, yeah, that is all I have to say about hidden card error. There is one other thing that I would like to say, which is thank you so much to everybody who is supporting me on Patreon. I really appreciate every one of you. If you would like to become one of my patrons, there still is time to vote for and suggest topics for the next month's patron pick ruling. And so if you're interested in doing that, there is a link in the description. But that is all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.